Mock draft season is officially here, and with the 27th pick in this year's draft, the San Francisco 49ers are sitting at a really interesting crossroads. There are a lot of directions this team could go, and depending on who you ask, the priorities feel pretty clear. Offensive line, wide receiver, maybe even defense if the board falls a certain way. But a recent mock draft threw a curveball that has a lot of fans doing double takes because it has the Niners using that first-round pick on a tight end. And at first glance, that probably sounds crazy to you. A tight end? When this team already has George Kittle? When there are obvious needs elsewhere? I get it. That was my first reaction too. But the more you dig into it, the more this starts to feel like one of those moments where the 49ers might have a real opportunity on their hands, one they can't afford to overlook. Daniel Jeremiah recently projected Oregon tight end Kenyan Sadi to the Niners at pick number 27. And whether you love mock drafts or think they're mostly noise, this one is worth talking about. Not just because of the player, but because of the context surrounding this roster right now. George Kittle is coming off an Achilles tear, and while everyone expects him to return, we still don't know exactly when that will be or what he's going to look like when he does. At the same time, Kyle Shanahan's offense has always leaned heavily on versatile, do-it-all players, guys who can block, catch, line up in different spots, and create matchup problems. And that's where this conversation really starts to get interesting. Before we go any further, if you care about smart 49ers roster moves and you want honest fan-to-fan breakdowns like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're pushing hard toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one helps us bring you more draft coverage, film talk, and daily Niners updates. And while you're at it, give this video a like if you appreciate these deeper dives. Let me ask you something right off the top. Would you be open to the Niners taking a tight end at 27? Simple yes or no. Drop it in the comments. And if you think another position is the obvious move, tell me what it is. Offensive line? Wide receiver? Something else? I really want to hear where your head is at. Because here's the thing. This isn't just about drafting a tight end. This is about planning for both the present and the future at the same time. The Niners aren't in a rebuild. They're in a window. They still believe they can compete for championships. But they also have aging core players, major injuries to account for, and a run game that didn't live up to expectations for large stretches of the season. Those realities matter when you're on the clock in the first round. And when you start looking at it through that lens, this idea of adding a versatile, high-upside tight end who can block, catch, and grow into a larger role doesn't feel nearly as random as it might have a few weeks ago. So in this video, we're going to break it all down. We'll start with what Daniel Jeremiah actually said and why he thinks Kenyan Sadi makes sense for Kyle Shanahan's system. Then we'll dive into Sadi as a player, what he did at Oregon, and what shows up on tape. After that, we'll talk about how this fits with the rest of the roster, what it means for guys like George Kittle and Jake Tongas, and whether this pick really makes more sense than going offensive line or wide receiver. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a clear verdict on what the Niners should do if Sadi is sitting there at 27. So stick with me because coming up next, we're getting into the actual mock draft logic and why Daniel Jeremiah believes this could be a perfect chess piece for Kyle Shanahan. Let's take a closer look at how this idea even started, because it didn't come out of nowhere. Daniel Jeremiah isn't just throwing darts at a board when he puts these mock drafts together. He talks to scouts, he talks to front offices, he studies tendencies, and while mock drafts are never perfect, they often give you a window into how league insiders are thinking. So when Jeremiah slotted Kenyan Sadi to the 49ers at pick 27, it immediately raised eyebrows, especially among Niners fans who are laser-focused on offensive line and wide receiver. Jeremiah's reasoning is actually pretty straightforward. He believes Sadi could go much higher than 27, but might slide because he's considered a bit undersized for a traditional tight end. At the same time, he sees elite speed for the position, competitive blocking, and the kind of versatility that offensive coaches dream about. In his words, Sadi would be the ultimate chess piece for Kyle Shanahan, a hybrid of George Kittle and Kyle Juszczyk. And if you've watched this offense over the years, you already know how much Shanahan values players who don't fit neatly into one box. Think about it. Kittle isn't just a tight end. He's essentially an extra offensive lineman in the run game and a top-tier receiving threat when healthy. Juszczyk isn't just a fullback. He lines up in the slot, out wide, in the backfield, and sometimes even as a tight end. Shanahan builds his scheme around guys who can move all over the formation and force defenses to reveal their intentions. That's exactly the type of role Jeremiah is projecting for Sadi. And at first, this probably still feels like a luxury pick to you. After all, the Niners already have Kittle, even if he's coming back from injury. But here's where timing matters. Nobody expected Kittle to tear his Achilles. That changes everything. Suddenly, tight end isn't just a future need. It's a present one, too. You don't know how many games he's going to miss. You don't know how explosive he'll be when he returns. And you definitely don't want to build your entire offensive plan around uncertainty at one of the most important positions in Shanahan's system. Right now, the 49ers have Jake Tonges and Luke Farrell handling most of the tight end snaps. Tonges stepped up in big moments and deserves credit for that, but he's also a restricted free agent, meaning his future isn't completely locked in. Farrell is more of a traditional depth piece. Braden Willis has flashed but hasn't carved out a major role, so if you zoom out, there's no clear long-term answer behind Kittle, and that's the opening Jeremiah is pointing to. Let me know what you think about this part. Specifically, do you buy the idea of drafting for versatility over pure positional need? Type versatility if you agree with that approach, or need if you'd rather the team strictly target offensive line or wide receiver. I'm curious where you fall on that. Another thing Jeremiah hinted at is that Sadi's stock could rise quickly once the combine and pro days get rolling. Speed, agility drills, and measurements matter a lot for tight ends. If Sadi tests the way scouts expect, there's a real chance he won't even be available at 27. So this isn't just about whether the Niners like him, it's about whether they'd even have the opportunity to take him if they wanted to. And that's why this conversation matters right now. The draft is still a few months away, but this is the window where front offices start stacking their boards, identifying tiers of players, and figuring out who fits their system best. The 49ers are doing exactly that behind the scenes. They're evaluating offensive linemen. They're studying wide receivers. And they're absolutely taking a long look at tight ends too, especially given Kittle's injury and the age of some key pieces on offense. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far and you want more draft coverage like this as we get closer to April, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. We're pushing toward that 1,000 subscriber goal, and hitting it means we can bring you even more film-based analysis and prospect deep dives. Because now that you understand why Jeremiah made this projection, the next step is breaking down the player himself. Who exactly is Kenyan Sadi? What did he actually do at Oregon? And does his game really translate to what Kyle Shanahan wants to do on Sundays? That's what we're getting into next as we dive into Sadi's production, his traits, and what shows up when you turn on the tape. All right, now let's talk about the player himself, because everything starts to make a lot more sense once you actually look at Kenyan Sadi's game. Sadi came out of Oregon, and over the past few seasons, you could see steady growth, but this most recent year was the real breakout. His role expanded, his production jumped, and he became one of the more reliable pieces in an offense that dealt with its share of injuries. When other weapons went down, Sadi was consistently there, moving the chains, finding soft spots in coverage, and finishing plays in the red zone. He ended the season with 8 touchdowns, and that alone should grab your attention because that tells you coaches trusted him in scoring situations. But he's not just a red zone guy. Turn on the tape and you see a tight end who can threaten defenses vertically, who has enough speed to pull linebackers out of position, and who understands how to sit down in zones. He's a natural pass catcher. He tracks the ball well, He doesn't panic with defenders closing in, and he shows good awareness of where the sticks are. That's huge in Shanahan's offense, which thrives on timing routes and precise spacing. What really separates Sadi, though, is that he isn't just a receiving tight end. He blocks, and not in a half-hearted way. He competes in the run game. He gets his hands inside, keeps his feet moving, and fights to stay attached to defenders. Is he a sixth offensive lineman like peak George Kittle? No, not yet. But the willingness is there, and that matters. Shanahan doesn't put players on the field if they can't hold up in the run game, especially at tight end. If you want snaps in this offense, you have to block. Sadi already shows that mentality. Physically, he's a little undersized compared to some traditional tight ends, and that's part of why he might be available at 27. But in today's NFL, that can actually be an advantage. Smaller, faster tight ends create matchup problems. Safeties struggle to stay with them. Linebackers have a hard time running with them. And when you add in his blocking effort, suddenly you've got a player who can stay on the field in multiple personnel groupings without tipping off the defense. This is where the chess piece label really comes into focus. Imagine Sadi lining up next to the tackle on one snap, then motioning into the slot on the next. Imagine him helping seal the edge on outside zone, then slipping into the flat-off play action. That's classic Kyle Shanahan football. That's how this offense keeps defenses guessing. And it's the same reason players like Kittle and Juszczyk have been so valuable over the years. Now think about development. Sadi wouldn't be walking into a vacuum. He'd be learning from George Kittle, one of the best all-around tight ends the league has ever seen, and from Kyle Juszczyk, who's made a career out of doing everything asked of him. Even if Sadi doesn't become a star right away, being able to sit behind those guys, study their habits, and absorb Shanahan's system could accelerate his growth in a big way. Let me ask you this. Have you watched any of Sadi's highlights or full games yet? If you have, drop one play in the comments that stood out to you. And if you haven't, would you rather see this team draft someone based on upside and fit, or someone who fills a more obvious hole right away? Type upside or need below. And while you're thinking about that, make sure you're subscribed if you want more prospect breakdowns like this. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and once we hit that mark, we're planning even deeper film dives on potential 49ers draft targets. Of course, no prospect is perfect. Sadi will need time to refine his route running, add strength, and adjust to NFL speed. Tight end is one of the hardest positions to transition from college to the pros. It usually takes a year or two before players really hit their stride. That's part of the risk here. You're drafting a player who might not give you elite production right away. But that also brings us back to the bigger picture. This isn't just about what Sadi can do in week 1. It's about what he can become in this system over the next 3 to 5 years, especially as Kittle and Juszczyk move deeper into their 30s. So now that you've got a better feel for Sadi as a player, the real question becomes this. Does taking him at 27 actually make more sense than addressing offensive line or wide receiver? That's exactly what we're diving into next, as we break down roster fit, alternatives, and whether this would be a smart move or a risky one. Now we get to the heart of the debate, because this is where opinions really start to split. Even if you like Kenyan Sadi as a player, the big question is whether taking him at 27 actually makes sense for this roster right now. On one side, you have the case for Sadi. It starts with George Kittle's injury. Achilles tears are no joke, especially for a player whose game is built on explosiveness, physicality, and cutting ability. Kittle will work like crazy to come back, and nobody doubts his toughness, but there's real uncertainty there. You don't know exactly when he'll return, and you don't know if he'll immediately look like the same player. Drafting Sadi gives you insurance. It gives you someone who can contribute while Kittle is out and grow into a bigger role over time. Then there's the run game. Let's be honest, the Niners' rushing attack didn't meet expectations for large stretches of the season. They had flashes, but they didn't consistently crack 4 yards per carry. And you could feel the difference when Kittle wasn't on the field. His blocking matters that much. Adding another tight end who's willing and able to block could help stabilize that part of the offense. No, Sadi isn't an offensive lineman, but Shanahan's scheme relies heavily on tight ends sealing edges, climbing to the second level, and creating angles. A versatile tight end can absolutely move the needle. There's also the long-term angle. Kittle and Juszczyk are both in their 30s. That doesn't mean they're washed, but in football terms, that's usually when players start moving past their physical prime. Drafting Sadi now allows the Niners to overlap generations. You're not waiting until Kittle is gone to find the next guy. You're developing his successor while the current core is still in place. That kind of planning is how good teams stay competitive year after year. But now let's talk about the other side, because there are real arguments against this pick too. The offensive line still needs help. That's not up for debate. Interior protection has been inconsistent, and depth across the line is always a concern. There are projected to be several quality linemen available in the late first round. Taking one of them could give you an immediate starter or at least a high upside piece who strengthens the trenches right away. Wide receiver is another obvious need. With uncertainty around Brandon Ayuk's future and a lack of proven depth behind the top options, adding a young receiver could help both in the short term and long term. A first-round wideout gives Brock Purdy another weapon and takes pressure off the rest of the offense. And let's not forget Jake Tongas. He stepped up when Kittle went down, and while he's a restricted free agent, the expectation is that the Niners will bring him back. If Tongas returns, you already have someone who can handle a good chunk of the tight end workload while Kittle recovers. That makes Sadi feel less like a necessity and more like a luxury. So really, this comes down to philosophy. Do you draft for immediate need, or do you draft for long-term fit and upside? If the Niners believe Sadi is a special player who perfectly fits Shanahan's system, you don't pass on that just because you also need a guard or a receiver. Good teams take difference makers when they're available. On the other hand, if they see similar grades on Sadi and several offensive linemen or wide receivers, then positional value might push them in a different direction. There's also the trade-down option. If Sadi is there and they think he'll still be available later, they could move back, pick up extra capital, and still address multiple needs. Let me know where you stand on this. Would you rather see the Niners trade down for offensive line help, grab a wide receiver, or stay put and take Sadi if he's on the board? Drop trade, WR, or Sadi in the comments so I can see how the fan base is leaning. And if you're enjoying this kind of roster construction talk, make sure you're subscribed. We're closing in on 1,000 subscribers, and hitting that milestone helps us bring you more detailed draft analysis and daily Niners content. Because now it's time to bring everything together. We've looked at the mock draft logic, we've broken down Sadi as a player, and we've weighed the pros and cons against other needs. Up next, we're wrapping it all up with a clear verdict on what the 49ers should do if Kenyan Sadi is sitting there at pick 27. Plus what you should be watching as the Combine and Pro Days get closer. Now let's bring it all together, because at the end of the day, this comes down to one simple question. If Kenyan Sadi is sitting there at pick 27, what should the 49ers actually do? Here's my honest take. This is one of those situations where the answer isn't black and white. It depends on how the board falls, what the medical outlook on George Kittle really looks like behind closed doors, and how the Niners stack their internal grades. But if Sadi is available, and the team truly believes he's a high-end fit for Kyle Shanahan's system, I think he deserves serious consideration. Not just as a luxury pick, as a strategic one. You're talking about a tight end who can catch, block, move around the formation, and grow into a larger role over time. You're talking about adding a player who can help stabilize the offense while Kittle recovers, and then potentially become a foundational piece as the roster evolves. That's not small. That's roster planning. That's thinking 2 or 3 years ahead instead of just plugging holes for the upcoming season. At the same time, the Niners can't ignore the offensive line. They can't ignore wide receiver. Those are real needs, and they matter, especially if this team wants to protect Brock Purdy and keep the offense explosive. So the ideal scenario might actually be flexibility. If Sadi is there and clearly the best player on their board, take him. If there's a lineman or receiver they love just as much, go that route. And if the value lines up, don't rule out trading down, picking up extra draft capital, and attacking multiple positions instead of just one. What I don't think they should do is force a pick based purely on position. That's how teams reach. That's how value gets lost. The Niners have been at their best when they draft players who fit their identity, who bring versatility, toughness, and football IQ. Sadi checks a lot of those boxes. Now here's what you, as a fan, should be watching over the next stretch. Pay attention to Sadi's combine numbers, especially his speed and agility drills. Tight ends who test well tend to climb boards fast. Watch what happens at Oregon's Pro Day. Listen closely to reports about George Kittle's rehab timeline. Keep an eye on Jake Tongas's contract situation, and watch for any chatter about the Niners potentially moving up or down in the first round. All of that is going to shape how realistic this scenario really is. And now I want your final vote. If Kenyan Sadi is available at 27, would you be happy with the pick? Comment yes or no below. And while you're down there, tell me which prospect you'd love to see a full film breakdown on next. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like it and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're pushing toward 1,000 subscribers, and hitting that goal helps us bring you more in-depth draft coverage, prospect analysis, and daily San Francisco 49ers updates. Your support genuinely makes a difference. We'll continue tracking every mock draft, every rumor, and every prospect tied to the Niners so you don't miss a thing. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.